Hello and welcome back. Let's talk about opacity and fill today. There is a lot of confusion about this, especially from people coming from Photoshop. In this video, I will explain opacity, fill opacity, and layer fill. But before I dive in, let's take a step back and analyze a layer in Affinity Photo. If we understand how a layer is set up in Affinity, it will all make sense. The layer in Affinity is probably an object defined in code. Each object can have properties, so the layer object in Affinity probably has a property for type, which could be a pixel, image, curve, or a mask. There's also a property called locked. So when this is set to true, you cannot modify the layer. It also has a property for opacity, a property for blend, which I'm guessing is another object that has its own properties, like the blend mode used, the blend options, containing the range, gamma, coverage, and so on. So coming back to the layer, there's a property called fill, which contains the actual content of a layer in a sub-property called pixels. And this fill probably also has its own opacity property. Continuing with the layer, it also has an effects property, which contains the different effects you can have on a layer with all their own sub-properties. And so on and so on. Probably there are much more properties, but I think you get the idea. Now that we understand how a layer is set up in Affinity, let's see what opacity actually is. Opacity is the level of transparency. Well, actually, it's the opposite of transparency. 100% opacity means no transparency, and vice versa. A 0% opacity results in a full transparent layer. Or, in other words, it's not visible. By the way, opacity is also sometimes known as alpha. Now let's get back to the opacity slider. The easy way to remember what this does is that it controls the transparency of the complete layer, which also include the effects applied to it. Remember the diagram I have drawn earlier? It controls this top level property, so changing this will affect everything related to the layer. Let's have a look. Here I have a circle with an outline effect applied. Let me double check. As you see, the outline effect is indeed turned on. When I go back to the layers panel and decrease the opacity, you see that the whole layer, including the outline effect, is made more transparent. Adjusting the opacity of a layer affects the whole layer. Next, let's focus on the fill opacity. And this is where a lot of Photoshop users get confused. There are two reasons for this. First of all, Photoshop does not have layer effects. And secondly, it gets mixed up with layer fill in Photoshop. To understand what fill opacity exactly is, we need to look back at the layer diagram I have drawn earlier. As you remember, each layer has a fill, or in other words, a contents property. This fill of a layer has its own opacity. In Affinity, we can control this by using the fill opacity slider. Modifying the fill opacity changes the transparency of the layer contents, but not the applied effects. So let's have a look how this works. Here I have a circle with an outline applied to it. When I change the fill opacity, you see that only the contents, in this case the black fill, is affected. The outline does not change. The question is, why would you need this? Well, here is a good example. Suppose you have an image, like this cat I enabled right now. I want to change the opacity of the cat to be lower. If I change the opacity of the layer, I will also lose the transparency on the outline. If I only want to lower the opacity of the cat image without affecting the border, I can use the fill opacity. Having the option to modify the fill opacity separately saves you the trouble of separating the outline and the image. Pretty useful, I would say. So I can change the fill opacity and my outline stays sharp and bright. Let me add another effect, like an inner glow. You see how cool this is. The glow stays the same while the image is lowered in opacity. What I think is missing in Affinity is the effect opacity next to fill opacity. Having an effect opacity would make things much clearer and consistent in the application. Anyway, let's talk about layer fill. This is something that is not available in Affinity Photo and should definitely not be confused with the fill opacity I just mentioned. The layer fill in Photoshop only applies to 8 special blend modes, which are shown in the text you see right now. For all other blend modes, the layer fill percentage behaves exactly like the opacity. Because this layer fill applies to only a special group of blending modes, it makes things confusing for even a lot of experienced Photoshop users. And I'm even pretty sure that a lot of Photoshop users also do not truly understand what is actually happening. If we understand what the layer fill exactly does, we probably can recreate it in Affinity Photo. To understand what layer fill is, we need to keep in mind that some blend modes have a neutral color. This color does not affect the layer below. For example, in the linear light, which is one of the 8 special blend modes, has a neutral color of 50% gray. I can quickly demonstrate this by adding a layer with 50% gray fill. I set the blend mode to linear light. As you see, nothing changes. Now let's add an orange color fill on top of the cat and set its blend mode to linear light. The orange layer will be blended in linear light with the cat. However, to demonstrate that the gray has no effect, I will use the paintbrush and paint with gray and see what happens. As expected, the areas I have painted with gray have no effect. Now comes the tricky part. What if I lower the opacity of the layer and make the transparent areas fill or mix with the neutral color? Actually, this is exactly what layer fill does. Let me undo the last couple of steps and show you what I mean. I'm going to put the orange layer back to normal blend mode and enable the fill layer with 50% gray in normal blend mode. If I now reduce the opacity of the orange layer to 50%, the orange layer is now mixed with the neutral color. You see that the orange layer now contains a lot of gray. This is exactly what layer fill does in Photoshop. If I group them together and set the group's blend mode from pass-through to linear light, let's see what happens. You notice that the effect is definitely dimmed down because there's a lot of neutral color in it. For comparison's sake, let me merge this to a new layer and then apply the orange layer again with linear light, but this time with 50% opacity. I will merge these two. Now we can compare them. The merge with a neutral color I will call Fill 50, and the one with opacity 50 I will call Opa 50. Let's compare. Definitely a huge difference. And this is the difference between opacity and layer fill in Photoshop. The layer fill in Photoshop lowers the opacity of the layer and mixes in the neutral color of the blend mode. As you have seen, we also have recreated the same functionality in Affinity Photo. Let's check if we are right, just to make sure. I have Photoshop open with the same cat image and have applied the same orange color layer with a layer fill of 30%. Let's recreate this in Affinity Photo. In order to reproduce the layer fill of 30%, I will add a layer with a neutral color for the blend mode. For linear light, as mentioned, this is 50% gray. Now I'm going to put this below the orange layer. After I group them and set the group's blend mode to linear light, I can set the opacity of the orange layer, or in Photoshop terminology, the layer fill to 30%. As you see, the results are exactly the same. To compare with Photoshop, the opacity of the layer is controlled by the opacity of the group. If I lower this to 50% and I lower the opacity to 50% in Photoshop, you get the same results. I can increase the fill to 50% in Photoshop, which means I need to increase the opacity of the color layer in the group to 50% to get the same results. And indeed it does. For the sake of completeness, let's also do a test with color burn. Let me change the blend mode of the orange layer in Photoshop to color burn and set its opacity to 100%. I will keep the layer fill to 50%. Now in Affinity, I will put the opacity of the group to 100% and change its blend mode to color burn. Let's check the opacity of the color layer, which acts like layer fill in Photoshop. This is already 50%. As you notice, the results are not the same. Why? Did you remember that I mentioned that you needed to use the neutral color of the blend mode? Well, in color burn, the neutral color is white. So if I change the color from gray to white, we get exactly the same result. Pretty awesome. Now the question is, and most people complain that Affinity does not have a layer fill, does Affinity need a layer fill option? In my honest opinion, no. With the way that layers and groups work in Affinity Photo, it is very easy to recreate this as you have seen. Secondly, it adds a layer of complexity that most users will not understand. Even most Photoshop users do not understand what's happening with layer fill. If Affinity ever decides to add this option, I would suggest to make it context aware, meaning that the fill percentage should only be shown when a layer has one of these special 8 blend modes. Then maybe the input would make more sense. Well, this has been a long video and I hope it clarified how opacities work in Affinity Photo. If you have any more questions or remarks, let me know in the comments. Thank you very much for watching and don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons if you like this video.